Did you know backing collisions involving emergency vehicles are one of the most common types of incidents in our industry? It's true. We'll tell you what you need to know to reduce the risk of injury and property damage caused by poor backing practices right now. Try to find the common element in the following two stories. Story number 1. An emergency responder from New Jersey was run over when he was spotting for an apparatus at the scene of an incident. Just before the tragedy, the driver of the engine had eye contact with the spotter in the officer's side mirror. Then, while backing, the driver was momentarily distracted by another moving vehicle in front of him, and he looked away. That was all it took. A moment. Story number 2. A Pennsylvania man was killed when an emergency vehicle ran over him as it was being backed into the station. At the time, the victim was behind the vehicle taking pictures. The driver was not using a spotter and could only see what was in his side mirrors. He never saw the victim and another bystander behind the vehicle. What do these two stories have in common? In both cases, the drivers did not have a complete visual picture of the area around their vehicles, yet they continued backing. In Story 1, the driver lost visual contact with his spotter. In Story 2, the driver had no idea what was behind his heavy apparatus. As a result, 2 people lost their lives. Now, I know these are extreme examples. Not every incident will result in a fatality. In fact, most times, backing incidents cause damage to vehicles or property, and that's not good either. So maybe you're thinking, how hard can this be? Our company hasn't had any problems with backing vehicles. Well, maybe not, but all it takes is one time. Just one time with a distracted driver or spotter. One time where safe backing practices aren't used. Are you ready for that one time? In this video, we're going to describe what a safe backing program looks like and why it's important to have best practice SOPs and SOGs in place that are followed and enforced. Next, we'll get into the responsibilities both drivers and spotters have in a backing situation. We'll focus on the critical importance of visual and verbal communication between drivers and spotters. That's what was missing in our first story. And finally, we'll show you situational factors where you could have backing problems. All right, let's roll. The best practices we describe in this video will apply to all types of vehicles used in emergency services. Each type of vehicle has unique features, so you need training and practice to understand how to operate the ones in your emergency fleet in a backing situation. As with other elements of your driver training program, your safe backing program starts with developing clearly defined SOPs and SOGs. VFIS's Emergency Vehicle Driver Training Manual offers a list, but these guidelines need to be tailored to the vehicles in your organization. So, what should be included? Well, first, the hazards of backing. Backing an emergency vehicle is dangerous to begin with. There are a lot of blind spots that interfere with the driver's ability to see hazards, like fixed objects, parked vehicles, trees, poles, overhead obstructions, or equipment taken off the back of the emergency vehicle and placed on the ground. There are also moving hazards, like pedestrians, children, or other emergency workers. You may have never thought about this, but the blind spot to the rear of your emergency vehicle can extend more than 100 feet, depending on the length of your vehicle. That leaves a lot of room for error. However, we're going to cover several ways for you to reduce the risk created by this blind spot. Next, and this is really important, the safest thing you can do is to avoid having to back up at all. When pulling up to an incident, drivers should always consider placing their vehicles in a way in which they can pull away later. Not having to back up is generally the safest option. Next SOG, identify the responsibilities for both drivers and spotters in a backing situation. These individuals need to know their specific responsibilities and how to communicate with each other. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Also important, your safe backing SOGs must include training evolutions for both drivers and non-driving personnel, or spotters. Specific training evolutions for backing are essential for drivers because number 1, they need to know each vehicle's handling characteristics so they can back up in any situation. And number 2, because they need to know how to work with a spotter. Spotters need to be part of the training evolution because they have to know how to effectively communicate with the driver and they need to know how to position themselves to stay safe. Here's an SOG you may not have thought about. You have to include enforcement procedures and disciplinary actions if an emergency worker fails to follow the established backing practices. Only then will drivers and spotters understand just how important safe backing is. Okay, let's move on to your backing training program. Drivers and spotters both should be trained in 3 areas. Number 1, hand signals. We'll go over these in detail later, but you should also review them in VFIS's Driver Training Manual. Number 2, the use of mirrors when backing. Adjust both mirrors for maximum visibility. Drivers should get help with the passenger side mirror. Then, in an actual backing situation or training evolution, drivers should use both mirrors, driver's side and passenger side, and monitor both mirrors every 3 to 5 seconds. But drivers shouldn't rely on them completely. Mirrors alone can't provide a complete picture when backing. And here's an obvious part of your training program. Number 3, know your emergency vehicle. I mentioned this earlier. Drivers and spotters need to be familiar with the characteristics of each vehicle in your fleet. They should know things like the turning radius and where the blind spots are. There can be a lot of invisible real estate to back into. Drivers and spotters should also know about the backing safety features on every vehicle. Fortunately for all of us, emergency vehicles can be equipped with aftermarket technology that makes backing a little less hazardous. But like mirrors, drivers shouldn't rely on them 100%. Nothing can replace a driver's own eyes and ears, and training. These safety devices include backup cameras, which show the driver the area behind the vehicle. Backup sensors, like an automatic reverse braking system that locks the rear brakes when the system makes contact with an object. Handheld wireless devices that the spotter uses, which send an audible and visual signal to the cab. Intercoms and radios are also invaluable for communications during a backing situation. Today, even bunker gear has gone high-tech. These suits are highly reflective in low-light conditions. Keep in mind, if you have any of these devices, you need to include the directions for their use in your backing SOGs and in your backing training program. Drivers and spotters need to know how to use them. We've talked about SOGs, training, and the importance of knowing your vehicle. Now, let's talk about the driver's responsibilities when they get behind the wheel. I mentioned this earlier. Drivers should avoid putting their vehicles into any unnecessary backing situation. You don't want to force backing when you don't have to. When arriving at the incident, scan the area to figure out the best placement for your vehicle that won't involve backing later. If you have to reposition the vehicle later during the incident, try to have a spotter with you. But here's a critical point. What happens if you don't have a spotter? What happens if you have to back your emergency vehicle and no spotter is available? First, before you get in, you have to conduct what's called a circle of safety. That means you walk completely around your vehicle, checking hazards at the back, sides, and overhead. Many drivers have been ambushed by a low tree limb or low-hanging wire. Then, get back inside and check your mirrors. Remember, as you're backing, you're going to check both mirrors every 3 to 5 seconds. Just before you put your vehicle in gear, give a final warning with 2 horn blasts. Then, proceed to back slowly. That's slowly. Speed and backing just don't mix. While you're backing, scan your mirrors constantly, looking for any stationary or moving hazards. Let's look at the same situation again, only this time you have a trained spotter with you. Now, make sure your spotter knows they're spotting for you in every situation. Don't just jump in the cab and presume because someone's standing near the back of the vehicle, they know they're supposed to spot for you. This is where communication comes into play. Make sure to establish visual and verbal contact with your spotter, and maintain it. If at any time you can't see or hear the spotter, hit the brakes immediately. What you can't see may hurt you or someone else. Your spotter could have tripped or fallen. That's what happened in our first story. Or they may be in danger. Maybe your spotter had to move to a new position to check for hazards. You just don't know. And if you don't know and you can't see, stop. Communication is important. Next, Both drivers and spotters need to know hand signals. Hand signals should be part of every company's training program. When you and your spotter are ready to go, you can begin to back up slowly. VFIS recommends that drivers use a spotter whenever possible during an emergency, a non-emergency, or training. Simply stated, it's just safer. Spotters may not have control of the vehicle, but their job is no less important. For a spotter, hand signals are critical. Spotters need to know how to communicate the right signal at the right time. A hand signals guide is included as part of VFIS's Emergency Vehicle Driver Training Program. VFIS recommends that spotters and drivers receive the same hand signal training so that communications are seamless. As a spotter, you need to learn these and use them in real situations and in training. If you're serving as a trained spotter in a backing situation, you're serving as the eyes of the driver outside of the vehicle. You have to observe what they cannot. First order of business, get the proper training to be a spotter. Make sure you're included in all the driver backing evolutions. During training, you should also become familiar with traffic control and safety issues, like the need for proper lighting, reflective clothing, and positive communications. You should learn how to use safety equipment for backing, like handheld wireless devices, flares, and signal lights. If you don't know how to use the equipment properly, you could be jeopardizing yourself, the driver, or someone else. Training is also where you want to get to know the driver's habits. This is where you want to refer to your organization's SOPs or SOGs. Your job as a spotter involves knowing your organization's emergency vehicles very well. Know their turning radius, their length, how articulating vehicles move and extend, and how trailers turn on a hitch. When you're on the scene of an incident, you've got to wear the right gear, like your bunker gear and a reflective safety vest. To stay safe, you need to be visible to the driver. We always come back to communication because it's important. Before the driver moves into reverse, you have to make that visual and verbal contact so that there is no question that the driver knows you're the spotter in this situation, either directly or through a radio or intercom system. Next, do a 360 around the vehicle. That's the circle of safety I mentioned a few minutes ago. You want to make sure there are no hazards or potential hazards in the way. On that 360, once again, look for any overhead obstructions or hazards. And speaking of hazards, don't you become one. Keep yourself from getting between the moving vehicle and stationary objects. Also, be aware of any hazards that could cause you to trip. Above all, stay safe. In our last segment on backing, we're going to address several situational factors. These are factors that are beyond your control and that can pose potential hazards to drivers, spotters, and vehicles in a backing situation. In this first scene, the driver has pulled up to let the emergency service workers get out to help the victim. The driver then has to move his vehicle out of the way. Since he doesn't have a spotter, he has to conduct the circle of safety himself. After he makes sure there are no visible hazards, he climbs into the cab and backs safely away. Responding to a call at night really complicates matters. All those hazards that are visible in daytime are a lot harder to see when it's dark. In this scene, the driver has to back around in a tight space with other parked vehicles. The spotter, though, is prepared. He's wearing a reflective safety vest and uses signal lights to direct the driver. Tight spaces always require a little more caution. In this scene, the driver is attempting to back into a narrow alley beside a building where there are several hazards: a telephone pole, a parked car, and a metal fence. This is a tricky backing situation that definitely calls for a spotter. This spotter walks around the vehicle to check for other hazards, then guides the driver into the alley using appropriate hand signals. Your station is another place where backing could be a challenge. This station is located in a busy neighborhood. In this scene, the spotter, wearing their safety vest, gets out of the cab and immediately stops traffic so the driver can back into the fire station. Often, EMS crews respond with limited manpower. With a patient in the back of the ambulance, the driver may not have a spotter. In these cases, conduct a circle of safety before getting back into the ambulance. Whenever possible, Ask the attendant in the back if they can give you a quick visual check out of the rear doors.
We're good to back up?
It looks okay.
For stations in rural areas, spotters may not have to stop traffic, but there are other hazards to watch for, like a kid on a bike or pedestrians. Remember, where you can, you want to avoid backing. In both of those situations, the ideal solution would be a pull-through bay. Many newer stations are designed with this feature so drivers can pull in and out easily. Here's another factor you can't control: overhead obstructions, like these low-hanging branches. In this scene, the driver would have a tough time seeing out of the officer's side mirror. This is another situation where you need a spotter to back safely. Power lines are also a potential hazard. Your spotter should always be looking for any type of obstruction above your vehicle. In all of these situations, you're going to have some challenges if you don't have a spotter, if you're not familiar with backing your vehicle, or if you can't use your mirrors effectively. Let's go over the best practices for backing one more time. First, make sure your organization has backing SOPs and SOGs in place, and these have to include training evolutions for both drivers and spotters. If you're a driver, know your vehicle. If you're a spotter, know your vehicle. Both drivers and spotters should be familiar with the safety features on the vehicle and the communication method you use in a backing situation. If you have to back a vehicle without a spotter, conduct a circle of safety before backing. Next, be aware of the fixed and moving hazards in the area where you're backing. If you can't see your spotter, stop. And maybe the most important piece of advice: avoid backing whenever you can. One more thing. Take your time. Take that extra couple of seconds to make absolutely certain it's okay to back your vehicle. VFIS wants you to be safe out there.